See them now?
Yes.
Perfect. Right. So it's well, I'm a molecular biologist, but I now work mostly with communication, policy, and more societal aspects of biotechnology. I work for Heidner Biocluster, which is a bioeconomy research cluster, and I also work with the Gene Innovate Research Consortium, which I will get back to in my presentation. So it's been mentioned also in the previous presentations that the public perception is very important going forward with genome editing, and it's clear that these technologies are not just disrupting science, but also the public opinion. So I will, over the next 10 minutes or so, I will give you some insights into this topic. If I can. So as probably most of you know, GMOs have been not particularly popular in Europe for many decades. This is just an excerpt from the Eurobarometer that was published in 2010, which showed that among consumers, around 66% were worried about GMOs, and I think it was the fourth highest ranking topic that they were concerned about in relation to food and risk. But these are typically the classical GMOs that we have seen on the global market for the last decades. And probably it's the situation is changing now that we get these new technologies. So that is something that we wanted to explore in the research project Gene Innovates, and we did a survey among Norwegian consumers to evaluate their attitudes towards genome editing, and then in a Norwegian context, so in agriculture and aquaculture. This is a large research project. It's a collaboration between academia and industry. So we have NMBU, which is the member, and Sigbjørn, who is the organizer of this. He's a central part of this academic part of the project, and it's also a collaboration with the breeding companies in different sectors, so in pigs, cattle, plants, and then of course fish. So, and this is the Gene Innovate Consortium, and it's also with the Biotechnology Advisory Board, which does the more legal and ethical parts and societal aspects. So the survey was it was a two-part survey. We did focus groups, which was to explore this topic in some depth, but it was also to inform the design of the quantitative population survey, and it's the population survey that I will show results from today. This was carried out in late 2019 and published in 2020. So, but we think that these results are still quite valid for the public opinion. What we did first is to investigate the baseline level of knowledge about these technologies. And when it comes to GMOs, or genetically modified food, we could see that the Norwegian population has a fair bit of knowledge. They classified their own knowledge as well, most of them had at least some knowledge of these technologies. However, when it came to genome editing, or CRISPR, we saw that around half of them had never even heard of the technology, which is of course a barrier for discussing public opinion about something that they don't know what is. So in order to explore their opinions, we had to also explain to them what we meant by genome editing. So we distinguished between traditional breeding and explained what we meant by that, and also classical GMOs, which we defined as transferring genes between species, and then genome editing, which is making changes within the species genome. And then we gave them some cases to evaluate on the use of these kind of genome editing technologies. So this is the main finding from the report. We gave them 5 different cases from each of the plants and livestock sector or animal sector with some different traits. So what we saw quite clearly is that public opinion to the different uses of the technology is quite different. So The majority of the respondents were positive towards several uses of the genome editing technology that were perceived to have benefits either to the consumer or to the environment or sustainability. So particularly relevant here for this forum today is a few cases on the bottom of or below the line in animals. So we had two cases that were concentrated on fish. So one was to improve fish health, for example, sea lice resistant salmon. And the other was to reduce the environmental impact by using sterile salmon. And we could see that in many of these cases, the majority was positive towards these kind of uses. They were more negative when it came to traits that could perhaps be perceived as trivial, such as changing the color of a product. And they were quite skeptical towards using genome editing to improve the yield of animals, such as increased muscle mass. And this was also confirmed in the focus groups that was a concern among consumers. I will show you some other results from the report. So we also asked them if they could see the use of genome editing in organic food production. And what we could see is that regardless of what type of food they normally buy, the majority was positive towards using genome editing to, for example, reduce the need for pesticides. So this is interesting considering that the organic sector has a blanket ban on these kind of technologies. However, although the majority were positive towards several uses of the technology, we could see that there was a certain level of worry about risk, perhaps not surprisingly. So both health risk for consumption and also environmental risk, the consumers were somewhat worried about the risk. We also wanted to look at the difference between or their attitudes depending on who is behind the development. So we asked them how positive or negative they were to products that were developed by international companies, typically GMOs, which is the top panel, compared to products developed for the Norwegian market by Norwegian researchers and breeding companies. And we can see that there was a significant difference. They were much more positive towards the locally developed products. We also asked about their level of trust. So the top bar here is the level of trust that the Norwegian breeding companies would use the technology in ways that benefit society and the environment. And the bottom bar is the trust in the authorities, or whether or not these products are safe if they are approved for the market. And we could see that the level of trust was fairly high in these cases. Another important aspect or societal aspect is labeling. As we know, in Europe, all these products, regardless of what type of technology has been used, if it's genetic engineering, it should be labeled as GMO, and we wanted to explore that. So we asked the respondents if they think they should be labeled, and we could see a clear support that genome edited products should be labeled. That's their opinion. But they also think that the label should distinguish between genome editing and classical GMOs, and it should contain information about the trait, and that's also logical given the fact that the trait or the purpose for making the edit is of importance for their attitude. In terms of the ethics, there was a report a few years back from the Danish Council on Ethics, which was, they had a statement there saying that it can be unethical not to use genome editing to solve major societal challenges. And we wanted to ask the public whether they support this view. And we saw that, yes, in fact, the majority did think that it can be unethical not to use genome editing in crops and livestock if it can contribute to solving important societal challenges. So in conclusion, in this report, and we have a lot of other interesting findings as well, so you can look, it's online. You can read the report if you want. The main conclusions are that it's important to change the narrative in this debate. It's not for or against the technology itself. It should rather be what to use it for. And I didn't show very many results from this part, but what we could see throughout the survey was that the level of knowledge that they have about the technology and about food in general has a lot of impact on their attitudes, and that the level of knowledge in general is quite low, not just about breeding techniques such as genome editing, but about food systems and genetics in general. So it's very important to build this knowledge in the public. And then finally, I would just mention that there have been done some other surveys after ours came out that are quite similar. There is one from Sweden. They looked only at plants, but they basically found the same, that there is little knowledge about genetics and genome editing and GMOs in the among the Swedish public. However, the majority are positive towards using genome editing for several purposes if it's beneficial for the environment and the society. But they are also worried about the risks associated. So it was very similar to what we found in Norway. And there has also been a survey in the UK that came out in 2021, which also found similar results. So there was quite low awareness and knowledge about genome edited food, and that's the level of knowledge is important for acceptance. They found that the consumers tended to think that genome edited food is more acceptable than genetically modified food, and that it should be regulated separately. And they also think that labeling should inform the consumer about whether these ingredients has been used, but that it should be labeled genome edited. And then finally, I will also mention the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which had a report on genome editing in animals, I think it was last year, which also found basically that through their dialogues, the public seem less concerned about the nature of the technology itself, but rather how it's being used, for what purpose, and in whose interests. So these are very important perspectives to keep in mind when addressing the public going forward. So thank you for your attention.